great to hear about the programs that CSP is doing. There's so much going on. Okay, welcome back to session 9. So last week we are still looking at Revelation on a whole. Really, sessions 6 through 10 is looking at the question of what is Revelation? How do we understand Revelation? We've been talking about revelation of Torah, revelation of God's presence. How do we understand sort of the divinity, the authority of Torah, depending on how we understand what revelation is. We looked at it through the lens of through Hasidut, through Jewish mysticism, thinking about revelation as God searching for man, and then man in turning back and searching for God. We looked at revelation also through the lens of Jewish theology last week. And specifically this week, we're continuing to think about Jewish theology, but we're going to be focusing on feminist Jewish theology. On one hand, I said this last week, on one hand, there's something that I feel uncomfortable in a sense of segregating out the feminist theologians, the women, from the men, as though to say, here are the male thinkers and here are the women thinkers. That's not at all my intention. The reason why we ended up doing them in 2 separate sessions is I wanted us to have time to really dig into specifically how is feminist theology sort of different and unique than theology at a whole, and to give space and really to give voice to feminist theology. And I felt that if we did all of that in one session, that there wouldn't be enough time for all of that. So that's how it ended up being feminist theology in their own session. And I'll say the basic question we're going to be looking at today, and this question really comes in the words of one of the great feminist Jewish theologians. We're going to talk about her a lot today, Dr. Judith Plaskow. This is her book here, Standing Again at Sinai. This is like a seminal work from a great Jewish feminist thinker and theologian, Judith Plaskow. One of her central questions is, and this is what we're going to keep coming back to in the session, is how would our conception of Torah and God be different if women were full participants in the formulation? So her premise there, her assumption is that women have not been full participants in the formulation of our Jewish canon, that all of it, Torah including, is written from a male perspective, from an androcentric male perspective, both from the Torah and all of the rabbinic text until really the modern day where we are. On the whole, Torah and rabbinic texts have primarily been written by men for a male audience. And so how does that change how we think of Torah? How does that define Torah? And so really her question is, how would our understanding of Torah and God be different if women were full participants in their formulation? That's going to be our question today. How would that change if theology is a study of what do we believe? What do we believe about God? What do we believe about faith? What do we believe about Torah? What do we believe about revelation? How is the answer to those questions, how would it be different if women are now full participants in the formulation of those texts of that Torah? So that's our question today. By way of starting to answer that, I actually want to dig into the Torah itself. So you don't have this on your source sheet, so I'm going to go ahead and just start screen sharing and we'll look at it together. Okay, so we're in the book of Exodus. We're in the Parsha, we're just at the moment of revelation. So we keep talking about revelation and you keep appropriately pushing me on what is revelation? What are we talking about when we say revelation? And I said, well, one of the answers of what I might mean when we say revelation is the revelation of Torah, the revelation at Sinai, the mountain, in a cloud, in fire, in flames, the thunder, and God thundering down, God's voice on high, revealing the Torah through Moshe. That's one sort of very specific moment of revelation, the revelation at Sinai. And so right before that happens, God is speaking to Moshe, and God prepares Moshe and says to Moshe, this is what you should tell the people. So I'm right here, I'm looking at chapter 19 of Exodus, verse 11. God says to Moshe, let them be ready for the 3rd day. For on the 3rd day, the Lord will come down in the sight of all the people on Mount Sinai. So we learn that there's this 3-day preparation that needs to happen, that something is going to happen, the people should get ready, and on the 3rd day, that's when God is going to come down. You shall set bounds for the people round about it, round the mountain, saying, beware of going up the mountain or touching the border of it. Whoever touches the mountain shall be put to death. No hand shall touch him, but he shall be either stoned or shot. Beast or man, he shall not live. When the ram's horn sounds a long blast, they may go up the mountain. So this is all really just God setting the stage for Revelation. This is something that we'll come back to in our final session. How is Revelation described in Torah? What is the experience of Revelation? Communal, primarily a communal experience? Is it primarily an individual experience? What might be some of the emotions with the experience of Revelation? But you see here, there's a sense in which Revelation is a very scary thing, that God is warning us, set boundaries, tell them not to go up the mountain. Whoever touches the mountain will be put to death. You're going to hear this ram's horn, the long blast, and then you'll know that it's safe to go up. So that's what God says to Moshe. Key words here in line 11, let them be ready on the third day. For on the third day, the Lord will come down. Also, let me just go back one more line here, that God says to Moshe, I will come to you in a thick cloud in order that the people may hear when I speak of you, and so trust you ever after. Then Moses reported the words to the Lord, and the Lord said to Moshe, this is key, go to the people and warn them to stay pure today and tomorrow. Let them wash their clothes and be ready on the third day. So God says to Moshe, go to the people, lech el ha'am, warn them to stay pure today and tomorrow. Let them wash their clothes, get them to a state of heightened purity, and be ready for the third day, because on the third day I'm coming down, okay? That's God to Moshe, and what does Moshe do? Moshe came down from the mountain to the people, and he warned the people to stay pure, and they washed their clothes. God said to Moshe, warn the people to stay pure on the third day I'm coming, and so that's what Moshe does. Vayered Moshe min hahar el ha'am v'yichadesh et ha'am. Moshe goes down from the mountain to the people, and he sanctifies the people, and he has them wash their clothes. And he said to the people, Vayomer el ha'am, heyu nechonim l'shloshet yamim al tikshu el hisha. He says, be ready for the third day. Do not go near a woman. What happened here? Something's a little bit different, okay? Moshe's done something, he went a little bit off on his own path. That in verse 10, God says, go to the people and warn them to stay pure today and tomorrow. Let them wash their clothes, be ready for the third day. God doesn't say anything about women or men. God is talking about people. Get the people ready, all the people. And what does Moshe do? Moshe says, be ready for the third day. Do not go near a woman. What is significant? What is different about the way that Moshe gives over God's instructions? And why is it important? So go ahead and you can just put that in the chat. What is different about what Moshe communicates it differently? What's different about the way Moshe communicates it, and why is it significant to us? Okay, good. So I think this is probably Susan, right? I'm trying to remember. I know it's always one of you. So from Susan and David Phillips, I think from Susan. So Susan says that Moshe is only talking to the males. That by default, because the Moshe says, do not go near a woman, it assumes, we didn't before, we just assumed, right, Beverly is saying this right now, Moshe implies that only the males will be involved with the revelation, right? Just by default of the way that Moshe is giving the direction over, do not go near a woman, it assumes that the audience that Moshe is speaking to must be men, whereas that was not at all clear from when God gave the instructions. From God, it seems like Moshe was to talk to the people, and suddenly when Moshe is giving the direction over, it seems like males are the intended audience and women's are being separated out. And Beverly is saying the extension of that is not only that in this moment, Moshe makes men the intended audience, whereas for God, it was all people, but it seems to imply that men are going to have a unique, or only males will be involved in the revelation. We don't go near the women because we need the men to be prepared, whereas that did not seem to be God's original intention. Rita is adding, it's of significance and not only are we separating out the women and making men the primary audience there, and men are then going to be the primary receivers of revelation, that also the way that we do is by saying women are impure, do not go near women in this moment. Cynthia says, Moshe doesn't include women as part of the people and denigrates the women as being dirty or impure. Yes. Okay. So this, I do want to say, for Moshe, there's a negative connotation to being with women. Okay, so one thing, I want to say what I think Moshe is doing and what Moshe is not doing. Just in general, I think purity and impurity, what is purity and impurity in the lens of Torah? Purity and impurity is that you have to be, I think we, in other texts, and I think also when we think of purity and impurity, we associate it with the words clean or dirty. They have very positive or negative connotations. I think in the lens of the Torah, that was less true. I think it was more a state of fact. You needed to be pure so that you could be ready to do what, either receive the Torah or interact with the tabernacle or interact with any of the priestly sacrifices. You needed to be factually in a state of purity. And if you weren't, you were in a state of impurity. And it was sort of, it wasn't like, there were all sorts of reasons why one might become pure and impure that weren't bad reasons. Like if you have a child, you become impure for a certain period of time. If you have a certain sickness, you might be impure for a certain period of time. If you bury your dead relative, which is obviously a mitzvah and something that you should be doing, you could become impure for a period of time. So just the fact alone of saying that women are impure, I don't think that is necessarily, we have to read that as a women are bad, women are dirty, necessarily. I think that impurity in the Torah is just a factual state. But I think what is really significant here is that Moshe adds in this line about do not go near the woman, which implies that the intended audience becomes male in a way that for God, it was not male. Okay, and that's going to be really significant, that whereas before we thought the audience was all people, now it's men. Whereas before Revelation was for all people, because Moshe adds that line, it becomes just men. Now the later rabbis are also going to have a problem with this line that Moshe adds here, al tiksu al isha, don't approach women. And the later rabbis will say, whoa, it couldn't be that women aren't a part of Revelation. And the later rabbis will add women back into Revelation and say, no, of course they had to be there. That the rabbis have that same discomfort that we might be having there. But the point of fact is that even in the Torah itself, Moshe separates them out, which at least creates the problem of distinguishing, of assuming a male audience that the rabbis then later have to respond to. So I want to read you just a little bit from, this is from Dr. Judith Plaskow's book, Standing Again at Sinai. This is a really seminal work in Jewish feminism, Jewish theology. So she writes, this is the very opening chapter. I'll just read you a few lines from it. It's called Setting the Problem, Laying the Ground. She says, the need for a feminist Judaism begins with hearing silence. It begins with noting the absence of women's history and experiences as shaping forces in the Jewish tradition. Half of Jews have been women, but men have been defined as normative Jews, while women's voices and experiences are largely invisible in the record of Jewish belief and experience that has come down to us. Women have lived Jewish history and carried its burdens, but women's perceptions and questions have not given form to scripture, shaped the direction of Jewish law, or found expression in liturgy. She's saying that women were there all along. Women were part of all the important parts of history, but women's voices are not the ones, women are not the ones who are giving shape to scripture, who are giving shape to Jewish law, who are finding expression in liturgy, that all that is written by and created by a male, like a male-centric, a male-dominant point of view. Confronting this silence raises disturbing questions and stirs the impulse toward far-reaching change. What in the tradition is ours? What can we claim that has not also wounded us? What would have been different had the great silence been filled? And so what Judith Plaskow is saying here, and what she then continues to lay out in the rest of her book, is she says the very beginning of Jewish feminism, if we want to begin to ask the question of what is Jewish feminism, what is Jewish feminist theology, the starting place of that is silence. The starting place of that is noticing the silences, is noticing the absence of the voices, is noting the ways in which women we've been talking about Revelation is the defining communal experience in which the Torah is revealed and God is revealed, the Jewish people are brought together. And yet in this defining moment at Sinai, it turns out, at least as Moshe has given it over, that the intended audience for that is men, and women have been written out of the picture. Women have been pushed to the side. And she's saying the very beginning of Jewish feminism is noticing those silences, is noticing those places in which women have been absent, and then leaning into thinking about, well, how would Torah be different if those silences weren't there? How would be Torah different if we were to fill in those perspectives? Okay, I'm going to pause with my screen sharing now. Let me give you a few more opening framing thoughts on what we're talking about when we think about Jewish feminist theology. And then if you have questions, I'd love to hear your questions. So just give me one moment. Okay. So Jewish feminist theology. What is Jewish feminist theology? So as Judith Plasko said, it's specifically listening to the silence and it's raising up perspective. It's as she put, it's as Dr. Plasko put, it's asking the question, how would Torah and God be different if women were full participants in their formulation? And so let's think about some of the ways in which it might be different. Let's think about some of the ways in which Jewish feminists have begun to sort of lay out their theology by leaning into the silence. So how would a feminist theology change our understanding of God and also change the language that we use for God? That a lot of the language that we use for God is male language. A lot of the images are male images. God as the warrior, God as the strong arm, God in all those male language, God as the one who battles for us. How would our conception of God change if we introduced more feminine understandings of God or feminine language? How would our prayers be different if our prayers didn't rely on this male language for God, but introduce feminine language for the divine? So those are some of the questions that Jewish feminist theology seeks to address. How, by just changing the way that we gender God by default, if we just change the gender, or what if we just didn't gender God, how might that change the metaphor and our relationship to God? Another question that Jewish feminist theology asks is how would Torah be different? That the Torah is largely male-centric. In the sense, you see, this is just one example, a moment in which the Torah, the defining moment of revelation, the Torah is assuming a male audience here, and women are pushed to the side. There are other moments, for example, the matriarchs, Sarah and Rachel and Leah, they are a major part of the stories. They even communicate with God and pray to God. We hear their stories of their struggles and the births of the children. And at the end of the day, it's Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob who are, the lineage comes down to them. It's always Elohei Abraham, Elohei Yitzchak, Elohei Yaakov, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. On the one hand, the mothers are a part of the story, but when it actually comes down to claiming that lineage to God, we are the descendants of who? The Torah uses that language, reinforcing Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and it's as if those women get pushed to the side. There are other moments. The Torah just takes for granted that land inheritance is going to go to the males, that the males are going to inherit all of that. Again, just sort of pushing women to the side. It's only when the daughters of Tzlochad in the book of Numbers say, wait a second, that's not fair. There are no males in our family to inherit. Can we make an exception in this case? Then that case goes to Moshe and goes up to God, and God makes an exception. But the default perspective is that the land is going to go to the males and the women are going to be written out. And so the question here is leaning into the silence of noticing all the places. Noah's wife, right? Noah, everyone knows Noah's name. We know that his wife and children go on with him, but we don't know the name of his wife. But there are other women, or the story of Dinah. We know all the stories of the brother, but Dinah, in the episode in which she has been raped and then the brothers take avenge on her behalf, she doesn't speak. She's completely silent. I could keep going, that there are so many moments in the Torah in which either women are not the focus, or women are pushed aside, or we don't hear their voices. And so the first step is to think about, well, how might we reclaim that Torah? How might we lean into those silences to bring back in the perspectives of females, of women that were always there. They were there fully, but we just don't have their voices. So that's part of what feminist theology is doing, is thinking about those silences. Another major question that feminist theology is thinking about is Halakha, is the role of Jewish law. Women's status in Halakha. There are a number of issues that come up because Halakha is created by men, because it in general is being created in a culture that is focused on putting male needs forward first. There are, even in terms of marriage, a man acquires a woman, which means at the end of the marriage, if they were to get divorced, the man has to release the woman. And if the man doesn't release the woman, halachically, according to Jewish law, the woman can be trapped into that marriage. Still today, there's the problem, it's called of agunot, of a woman being chained into the marriage, that if the man doesn't give the woman a get, doesn't give her a Jewish divorce, she's chained in, that the man has the power of that. Or the issue of women not counting towards a minyan, of not being full people in the eyes of Jewish law. There's a number of halachic issues regarding women's status. And so one of the questions that Jewish feminist theologians ask is, in this system of law that was for hundreds and thousands of years created by men, what is the status of women, and how might we change halakha? Is halakha a system that we should be working within, or how might we change or allow for change in halakha? And how do we relate to halakha as being? Do we relate to halakha as being divine? If we relate to all of Torah as being this divine revelation, then Jewish law is binding and divine. And does that leave any room for improving or changing women's status? Or if we don't relate to halakha that way, we do think there's room to change halakha on sort of our new authority and make space for women, then what does that reveal about our understanding of whether or not that law was divine in the first place? So these are a lot of the questions that are coming up as these theologians are leaning into the silence, as they're trying to raise up women's perspectives to bring together new voices. We find questions coming up about conceptions of God, about our understandings of Torah, and about the status of women in halakha, about the very language that we're using in our liturgy. Okay, I'm gonna pause there. And I see that there are lots of questions in the chat, so let's see what's going on there. Okay, so Toby says, one has to keep in mind that men were the ones who told the stories and wrote the books, thus throwing sexism into the stories, right? And so Toby, this is really a difficult and hard question, because on one hand, many of us, or at least many of us, or some of us, we want to relate to the Torah as being a divine document, as a divine revelation that comes from God. And on the other hand, there's the tension of also that revelation either being filtered through human hands or actually written by human hands, or a product of the society in which it relates. So if we, on one hand, Toby, you're exactly right, accept that a lot of the male-centric focus we're seeing is because it was men who wrote down these stories and it's their perspectives, then how does that change the way we relate to the Torah as being a divine document? Does that make it somehow less holy? Are we able to hold that both it came through human hands and is a product of the time in which it came in, and at the same time it is divine in some way? Are we able to hold both of those things? Mindy says, the Orthodox, at least Chabad, says that Hashem came first to Beit Jacob, and they listened and accepted, and women are on a higher plane than men. Yes, Lindy, I think more there to be said, but there's different ways of addressing the gap in women. So some people would say that the reason why women aren't obligated in certain mitzvot is that they're on a higher plane than men, and so they don't need they don't need to perform those mitzvot in those ways. Which is just to say, whether you find that personally satisfying or not, that there are different people that are wrestling with the tension of not seeing women as being, why aren't women sort of being treated in the same way, and having to find reasons to explain that. Beth noting that the Torah is written in the feminine is a feminine noun. That's interesting. David says, beginner speaking, but isn't Talmud worse? Yeah, I think, David, what you're saying is that in the same way that the Torah is a misogynistic document, and so is the Mishnah, and so is the Talmud, yes, you're absolutely right. There's lots of problems that we could run into there. I think what I want to say there is I want to say that it's not, that our tradition is not one note, is that there are a lot of things in the Talmud. If we wanted to do a class on problematic things in the Talmud, I could teach a really great class on it. And at the same time, the Talmud also says a lot of really beautiful things and tries to empower women in all sorts of places and protect women in all sorts of places. And so I don't want you to come away from this class saying the Talmud says, what the Talmud says about women is all X. It's very multivariate, and there's a lot of different voices. But yes, David, you're right, that there's specifically an example of that is the sota, is the adulterous woman who is suspected of cheating on her husband. The Torah says one thing about what we do to her. She's subjected to this public ritual and made to drink this liquid, and then if it turns out that she's has cheated, her like insides explode, and if not, then she goes out scot-free. and then, which is bad enough, that sort of public humiliating ritual, and the Mishnah makes it much worse. The Mishnah has the rabbis actually the priest ripping her clothes off, that they actually make it an even more humiliating ritual. Interestingly enough, the Talmud then debates whether or not that ritual should ever be put in practice. That in the whole tractate devoted to the issue of sota, some of the rabbis say a man is obligated, if he suspects his wife of cheating, is obligated to subject her to this horrifying ritual. And others say a man, it is forbidden to subject her to this ritual that the Torah itself mandated. So we see that the rabbis themselves sometimes, on the one hand, that they are creating the problems, they are sometimes also wrestling with the same problems that we are. No, mom, the man does not need a get. Also, the man gives the woman a get. It's very unbalanced. It's a real problem. And there are ways that there are workarounds that people find, but it's an imbalance that, in the same way that the man acquires the woman in marriage, it means that the man has to then release the woman at the end of the marriage. And if he doesn't, then she's trapped in that. It's a major problem. Yes, Heather is pointing out another halachic issue in terms of women being full people, that women can't be witnesses in court. Ken says, are we not applying today's standards to a different era, the time of the writing of the Torah and the Talmud? Yes, Ken, absolutely. I think that you're right. I think someone else was saying here, we can't judge a text. Yeah, that's a real question. I think that that's important to raise, Ken, that we can't, in a sense, we can't judge the text by the same standards as today. We have to understand the text in the context in which it was created. And on the other hand, because the Torah is eternal, and the Halakha is binding for us today, and the Torah and the Halakha is meant to speak to us today, there's a sense in which we have to judge it by our own standards, because we're not saying that, well, that was specific to the time it was written in, and therefore it doesn't apply, that those halachot of the agunot, of the women being bound in marriage, it still applies. And so that's why on the one hand, we have to be careful not to not judge it by our standards, meaning to understand it in the context in which it was created. And on the other hand, we actually do have to relate to it, because those laws are we're still in relationship to those laws today. They're meant to be binding and eternal to us. Okay. Right, Annette asks, is there any law in the Torah or Talmud if the man is the adulterer? No, the answer is no. You're pointing out a great question, that again, the woman is focusing on the woman as the one who goes astray. The ban is against a woman having multiple husbands or cheating on her husband, that we're not concerned about a man. And later they do make that forbidden. Don't get me wrong, polygamy gets outlawed, but the Torah is not concerned with a man having multiple wives or multiple partners. We're concerned about controlling women in that way. So that's another example. Okay. So we've raised a lot of questions and a lot of problems. Let's see what Dr. Judith Plaskow does with it. So I'm going to go back into screen sharing. Okay, let me make this bigger. So this comes from her book again, the book, Standing Again at Sinai. She says here, scripture itself is a product of community. It's a big sentence to unpack. Scripture itself, meaning Torah itself, this document that has been revealed, is a product of community. So what does she mean when she says that? It may be revelatory or communicate lasting values, but revelation is communally received and molded. So Ken, I think that sort of goes back to some point to what you were saying, that revelation is communally received and it's molded in some sense to the community and the time in which it is given. Revelation is the experience of a reality that transcends language, that cannot be captured or possessed in words. The communal experience of God's presence and power that lie at the origins of Jewish existence were crystallized by certain sensitive individuals and recreated in language to be stored in memory. Language bears witness to revelation. It allows the possibility that centuries after the original event, one may find reverberating in a text the extraordinary experience in which it was formed. It's such a beautiful description of revelation, that revelation was something that was captured by a small number of people, and it was stored in language that gives shape to the memory. Language bears witness to the revelation, that reverberating in a text, that extraordinary experience. But language bears witness to the enduring in words that are limited. Not only must it suggest rather than chronicle the revelatory experience, it does so within the cultural framework that language itself inscribes. So again, this is what Ken was saying. Revelation may surprise us and destroy our preconceptions, but it must compete with language already in place. It's an interesting that language that she uses here, that the revelation itself has to compete with the language that we already exist, the way that we already know how to talk about set categories. The Bible emerged in a context in which patriarchal modes of social organization were being consolidated and justified. The record of Revelation is, for the most part, assimilated to this task and never decisively breaks with it, which is to say, the language that is used to record Revelation is assimilated with the task of the patriarchy, which was to consolidate and justify the organization of the patriarchy that already existed at that time. That Revelation just sort of goes into that existing framework, a society that was very patriarchal in that time period. As we have seen, women's revelatory experiences are largely omitted from the sources. Narratives are framed from an androcentric perspective. I mean, this is clear from the fact that when Moshe says, get ready to go up the mountain, don't go near a woman, that it's assuming a male audience there. Even the fact that the Mishnah, the oral law, is divided into 6 books, and one of the codes is called Nashim, one of the codes is called women, but there's no code that's called men. This is something that Judith Plaska points out in her book. The fact that there's a code that's called women and no code that calls men assumes that it's a male audience that's reading the tractate that's about women, that women's experiences are being set off but being studied and written about by men. As we have seen, women's revelatory experiences are largely omitted from the sources. Narratives are framed from an androcentric perspective. The law enforces women's subordination in the patriarchal family. Insofar as biblical texts silence women and serves to oppress them, they must be criticized as revealing patriarchy. It's interesting what she's doing here is we're talking about, she's like playing with the word revealing of what is the revelation here. We're talking about the revelation of Torah, the revelation of God, and she said, to the extent that the revelation of Torah is limited by the constraints of language, the language that is the language of patriarchy, really part of what is being revealed at Sinai is patriarchy is being revealed. It's not just Torah that's being revealed, but patriarchy is being revealed through the language through which revelation is recorded. The authority that grounds this criticism, however, is not individual experience or some private intuition. It is rather the experience of particular communities struggling for religious transformation. For example, the community that is my central authority is the Jewish feminist community, for it is in this community my identity finds fullest expression. The question of authority is a really big question for Jewish feminist theology, because if we're to suggest that the Torah we have here is a Torah which is lacking in women's voices, or that the Halakha is an incomplete Halakha to the extent that women were not full participators in the creation of the Halakha, on whose authority can we change the Halakha? Especially if we relate to the Halakha, the law and the Torah as being divine and given over, on whose authority was that Halakha created, and on whose authority can that Halakha be challenged or be amended so that women are included as full participants in its creation. But beyond it lies the Chavurah, lies the group and the broader feminist communities, the wider Jewish community, and the communities of all those working for religious and political change. Just as Jews of the past experienced God and interpreted their experience in communal context that shaped what they saw and heard, so we also read their words and experience God in communities in continuity with, but different from theirs. It is the contemporary feminist community that has taught me to value and attend to women's experience. This community that has taught me that Jewish sources have been partial and oppressive, occasionally ugly, and simply wrong. It's a really strong statement, her last statement. First, she's saying the Torah is received in community and it's understood in community. And so this extent to which the revelation of the Torah and the language with it's transcribed is grounded and limited by and defined by the community in which it was originally received back when. And also today, we, by necessity, we have to understand and we have to interpret the Torah in the context of which the community that we are in now And if what that community is teaching us and saying to us is that these Jewish sources are partial and oppressive, that we have to be willing to sometimes call out the Torah, to call out halakha and say these are partial, they're lacking women's full voices, and as a result they are oppressive, they are occasionally ugly, and they're simply wrong, and to be willing to say that. Okay, let me pause there. I'm curious to hear your thoughts to Dr. Judith Plasko. What is she teaching us here about Revelation? The last thing that I'll just say as you're formulating your thoughts and putting into the chat is I see a lot of echoes here. This was last week's source sheet. We looked at Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel, and when he was talking about the revelation, he said the nature of revelation being an event in the realm of the ineffable, something that can't be described, is something which words cannot spell, which human language will never be able to portray. He says that the way that we write about Revelation itself, he says, as a report about Revelation, the Bible itself is a Midrash. It's already an interpretation. And so I hear echoes of that in what she's saying, that Heschel is also saying there are no words to contain or define Revelation, that anytime we try to put Revelation into writing, it's already different from the event itself. It's already interpretation. And what she is then going on, he's talking about the impossibility of doing that, that language can't capture it. She's saying we've used language to capture it, but it means that the language is flawed or lacking in some sense, because that language bears the marks of the community, which in this case, the patriarchal community through which that language was created. Okay, let's see what's going on in the chat there. What do you think here about Dr. Judith Plasko? So Annette says her comments make total sense to me. I mean, I think it's something, yeah, it's something important and profound about language. Heschel speaking to the inability of language to contain revelation. She's speaking to, we only have the language that we have. And so by definition, our language is going to be limited, and our definition of revelation is going to be limited by the frame and the social context in which we are living. And so then she's saying, given that, we have to accept that, and we have to be willing to challenge that and sort of re-understand, to bring new language to revelation in the community in which we are currently reading it, as opposed to the community in which it was given. Susan says, Susan and David say, it's absolutely true that revelation cannot be accurately conveyed in words 100%. Yeah. Okay, so let's go, while we're chewing on Dr. Plasko's thoughts, let's go on. We're going to see a different thinker now. This comes from the next one we're going to look at. This comes from Dr. Tamar Ross. What's sort of incredible about Dr. Tamar Ross is she's a Jewish feminist theologian, but writing within the Orthodox world. Because one of the problems that come up for the Jewish feminist theologians that you see is it comes up for Dr. Plasko and for other feminist theologians. A lot of them are writing from outside of the Orthodox community, because one of the main issues that they have to contend with is halakha, is Jewish law, in which women are seen to be relegated or oppressed, or not being given their full expression and personhood. And so the question of what to do with halakha like that, can we change it? Do we have the authority to change it? It's particularly hard within an Orthodox context. And so Dr. Tamar Ross, one of the things that she is doing is she, on one hand, wants to acknowledge the difficulties, these halachic problems that are facing women's status in Judaism, and to figure out how to address it, but she's not willing to give up on halakha, and she's not willing to give up on the divine authority of the Torah. Whereas Judith Plasko in her book, she specifically says, she talks about halakha, but she sort of specifically says, I'm not sure if the halachic system can be saved. If a system that was created by men for men, if it's sort of too late to now go back and add women's voices, if halakha as a system that is like a power that is condensed up here, a hierarchical power coming down on high, if as a system it's not actually workable to a modern feminist perspective of raising up multiple perspectives and voices, Judith Plasko is not so sure about where we're going to land in halakha. Whereas Dr. Tamar Ross, writing within the Orthodox movement, on one hand is acknowledging the sort of some of the problems that come up for women in halakha that need to be addressed and faced in a real way, that there needs to be able to be a shifting in halakha, but at the same time, she's not willing to give up on halakha. This is the system that she wants to work within, or to give up on the divine nature of Torah. And so her writings on Jewish feminist theology are particularly compelling and interesting. How is she able to both move us forward and push halakha forward, while at the same time, and on what authority, while at the same time holding on to the divine nature of Torah, holding on to the divine nature of law. Okay. And so the book that she writes is called Expanding the Palace of Torah. Again, a really important work in Jewish feminist theology, expanding the palace of Torah. So, and this text comes from an interview that she did with Dr. Alan Brill. It's a multi-part series unpacking her theory of revelation. She was very influenced by the theologian Rav Kook, and she coins this idea of a revelation. The language she uses is cumulatism, a cumulative revelation. So we'll see what that means. What is your dynamic view of revelation, he asks her. A dynamic view of revelation is not my invention. It is a well-established strand in Jewish tradition. The stipulation of the sages that the Torah is not in heaven already recognizes the importance of human interaction with the text in establishing its ultimate meaning, and appears to foster a spirit of pluralism as well. This is evident in the rabbinic declaration that there are 70 faces to Torah, and in the story of the heavenly voice that mediated the conflicting legal opinions of the schools of Hillel and Shammai by proclaiming that both these and these are the words of the living God. Okay, so what she's going to put forth is a dynamic, changing view of revelation. She's going to say that revelation is not a one-time event that occurred at Sinai, but rather revelation is something that is accumulative and is being added and further interpreted and changing in every generation. And ultimately, we have to sort of, in the context in which we are in, revelation continues to happen and unfold. And she wants to say from the get-go, this isn't something I invented. I didn't invent this idea, this dynamic continuing to unfold revelation. We actually see proof of it in 3 different well-accepted Jewish texts. One is the fact that in the book of Devarim, the sages say, the Torah says, Lo b'shamayim hi le'mar mi ya'aleh lanu hashamaya. That Moshe says to the people, don't say, Moshe says to the people, it is not in the heavens that you should say, who should go up to the heavens and get it? And don't say that is in the sea, that who should say, who can go across the other side? But rather, the thing is very close to you, that Moshe is admonishing the people and saying, don't think that the Torah is something far away from you. The Torah is not in the heavens. It's not across the sea. It's not inaccessible to you, but the Torah is something that's very close to you. It's something that you have a hand in and you have a part in. And there's later rabbinic texts that talk about, there's a text that talk about the Jewish laws being forgotten. And so the people go to the leaders and say, can you go up to God and get these laws back for us? We've forgotten these laws. And they say, Lo b'shamayim hi, it's no longer in the heavens, meaning it's down on earth. We have to create the law ourselves. We have to remember the law itself. I can't go back there. So this line of Lo b'shamayim hi is a way of saying it's not in the heavens, it's not in God, it's not far away, but actually we have responsibility for itself. So she cites this piece here. She says the fact that we have this expression, it's not in the heavens, it's in our hands. The fact that we have this idea, this principle, there are 70 faces to the Torah, meaning that every verse can be interpreted 70 different ways, that there are all of these different interpretations. And the fact that there was a story of the divine voice that came out that had the schools of Hillel and Shammai would be on conflicting sides of the same issue. And on one hand, we had a rule, and most of the times we rule and we say, the ruling goes according to Hillel, but we say, even though the ruling goes according to Hillel, both of these, Hillel and Shammai, are the words of the living God. Both of these are truth. That we're holding from the get-go, we're holding these, that different interpretations and ideas can exist simultaneously. In acknowledging the human factor that led to plurality, when interpreting the received tradition, the rabbis understood God as attaching religious value to human participation in the process of deliberation and the overcoming of ambiguities. Lo b'shamayim hi, it's not in the heavens, is to say that God values human participation in the process. This breadth of understanding on their part is evident again in their interest in preserving minority opinions as an essential part of the canon, even when the law was determined otherwise. Further support for a more dynamic understanding of revelation that blurs the boundaries between the divine word and the human interpreter can be found in various agadot, in sort of legends or stories, in Kabbalistic literature, in the writings of biblical commentators, in the legal writings, and especially in the interpretations of many of the Hasidic masters, who do not pose God and his word as utterly distinct and separate from the flow of history and human subjectivity. Viewed collectively, these more fluid conceptions of Torah present the Sinai revelation of God's word as the initiator of a series of revelations in the form of inspired interpretations throughout the ages. The ideal meaning of the Sinaitic revelation is eked out only with these accumulated interpretations. The idea being, she's saying what Sinai is, what revelation is not, is a one-time thing that happened at Sinai. Rather, Sinai, the revelation of God's word at Sinai, was the initiator of a series of revelations that keeps occurring, and we only understand the initial meaning of what God meant at Sinai through these accumulated interpretations that we're doing in our own times. The various strata are then absorbed as an integral part of the primary text, expanding upon and sometimes even transforming its original meaning, while forever remaining rooted in its precise language and frames of reference. Aside from avoiding gross anthropomorphisms, if we are to understand God's word as conveying a message for all generations, its transmission cannot be limited to a one-time event, but must be understood as a process. This is key, that this is part of what's challenging about halakha, that on the one hand, we're not to judge halakha because it was created in the time period in which it was created, but halakha is meant to speak to our lives today. It's meant to be eternal. We're still meant to follow its laws. And so she's saying, if God's word, if halakha is meant to be a message, is meant to be applicable to all generations, then it can't have been a one-time event, but rather halakha, revelation, must be an ongoing process that is still happening today, that we're still understanding and re-understanding. This process begins with the formal canonization of the Torah and its acceptance by the Jewish people as the primary filter through which the authorized beliefs and practices of Judaism are determined. It continues, however, with the cumulative interpretations that accrue to this text. So this is where her language of cumulative revelation, cumulatism, inevitably informing and altering its meaning in light of the ever-changing historical context in which we read. Viewed religiously, these contexts, no less than the original text, may likewise be regarded as an ongoing revelation of the divine word, constantly refining its meaning in light of new surrounding circumstances. So this is key. She's saying both the Torah is divine, both the original revelation is divine, but also the ongoing interpretations, the cumulative interpretations, these are also divine, and they're an ongoing revelation of the divine word. As a result, the Torah can be understood as all human in terms of its literary and historical genesis, and all divine in terms of its origin, value, and significance at one and the same time. And so what she's done here is she's really wrestling with the question on whose authority and how can we make the necessary changes we have to make with halakha while still regarding the Torah as divine, while still staying within the system of halakha. And she's saying both the initial iteration of revelation is divine, but also so are all the cumulative interpretations. These are divine as well, and it's all part of the same process. And she is able to hold both the divinity of the Torah in terms of its origin, it's important to us, while also saying it's filtered through human hands, and human hands in terms of how it's written, and therefore both in the time in which it's coming through us, human hands had an act in sort of filtering it, in contextualizing it, but also so today we can only understand the Torah through the circumstances, through what we are living today. Okay, let me pause there. I'd love to hear your thoughts, your responses. This is Dr. Tamar Ross. How is this idea of cumulative revelation landing with you? And both, I'd love to have you respond to Tamar Ross, but also I want to just throw a few questions at you here. Either to respond to her, how you're understanding cumulative revelation, or if you want to throw out now, how does your own conception of revelation inform your relationship to halakha and Jewish practice? So we've been talking a lot about here today revelation? How do you understand revelation? How do you understand Jewish law and halakha? So the question here and what Dr. Tomer Ross is addressing is, how does your own relationship to revelation inform how you think about Jewish law? How do you relate to Jewish law in your own life? Okay, so
let me ask a question while people are chatting their points. So going back to this kind of concept of ongoing revelation, which we've explored in a variety of contexts, including with Rabbi Brad Artson and process theology. But my question for him, a same question for you, is you still have to go back to the text, look at the text you showed us, for example, with Moses telling the people not to go near women. And that is text, that is black and white text. So how do you reread that language? Do you say that language is a misunderstood language? That language has to be ignored? Because I completely understand and agree that revelation is ongoing, but you still have problems, many problems in text where it's black and white in the text itself that says something contrary to a contemporary understanding of revelation and women's role in religion.
Right. So I think that Dr. Plaskow would say sometimes when you go back to the text, you have to actually be willing to unabashedly say that text is wrong, or that text is ugly, or that text is lacking. It seems like she's just willing to straight out say that about the text. I don't know if Dr. Ross would use that same kind of language that Dr. Plaskow would say. I think for me, personally, I think it's a process of both very much having to go back to the original text, study the text, honor the text. I don't know that I would say things like, I don't know, when the Torah, it's pretty clear to me that when the Torah talks about stoning the rebellious son, that's wrong, that we're not supposed to be doing that. But again, I guess Ari, I guess what I'll say is, like, this goes back to, maybe I think I'm putting words in Ken's mouth, but this goes back to not judging the text in the time in which it was created. I can sort of reject the morality being put forward by the text, like the Sota ritual. I don't feel that it gets me anywhere to judge the text in the context in which it was created and to say that text is bad or that text is wrong. I want to learn the text and understand the text, and then I want to reinterpret the text with the 70 faces of Torah to figure out, how can I bring this text forward today? What else might this text have to teach me today? Or what might I have to teach the text? Okay, let me see. You're writing wonderful things here. Wow, it's hard to know how far to go back. Okay, I'm just gonna go back to a random place because you've written a lot and it's great. So Susan says, as the Talmud brought Torah up to date after the loss of the temple, so it has to be brought up to date to the current lives of women. Yeah, so very much, Susan. I think that there's a lot of echoes of what we're hearing today of Dr. Plaskow saying that we have to read the Torah in the context of the community in which we are in, and Dr. Ross saying that there's this ongoing revelation of reading in the circumstances that we're in, of bringing the Torah up to date in a sense. Susan and David say, since reverberates down through the generations and the ages, to me clearly true. Oh, Sinai, yeah, Sinai reverberates. I love that language of reverberates down through the generations and the ages. Howard says, is the process of accumulated revelation asymptotic or ultimately exact? That is, does it always move closer and closer to the ultimate meaning intended by God without ever actually reaching it? Or does it actually enable humanity to ultimately capture the full scope and detail of God's intent? Wow, Howard, what a profound, amazing question. I don't know the answer to that question. I guess if you want to know my impulse there, I think this is what's meant by, I think you're teaching me a new word here, asymptotic. It seems to me that it's the first one. Can we ever, the second applies, can we ever actually capture the full scope and detail of God's intent? That to me sounds like we're striving for, but something that's impossible. I don't know, God, it seems to me that God has chosen to reveal God's will in the world in a way that it's not fully revealed to us, that we don't actually know, that we're left to do a lot of guessing. And so I think that there's actually something really beautiful, Howard, the way you frame the first part of it, that it's as though we're getting closer and striving to understand something, to manifest God's will in the world, but we're never actually going to get there, but we're going to keep striving for it anyway. That to me sounds right, but I love the way that you phrase that. Rochelle says, this seems to mirror that our own experience consists of one's own lived experience in interaction with the understanding of the living experiences of others. Yes, that our own experience consists of one's own lived experience in interaction with understanding the living experience of others. Rochelle, I'm not sure if you're saying this, but this feels related to me. My mom just had the revelation that, you know, on the Zoom screen that your picture always appears next to the teachers, next to the host. And it's like, you always seem like you're like in prime, that there's a, and that there's a, and, but you're seeing a different Zoom screen than everyone else. You know, everyone else is always seeing themselves next to the host, that your experience of the class is always being filtered primarily through your lens, through your own experience, and then it's in interaction with other people's. So that feels related to me. Okay, we have to stop just about now for the sake of time. But there are so many great comments. I'll read my mom's out for the last one, but I'm not going to answer it, but because I don't know the answer, but it's such a good one. My mom says, what if the community interprets the text in a revolutionary way? Can the community interpret it wrongly? I'm hesitant to say yes, but I think that the answer there is probably yes. I think that I would probably argue that some communities with the way that they're interpreting the will of God, and I think doing it, I mean, I think that this is the real danger. I think this is the real danger of having God's will not be revealed in the world in a real way, that we are left to do a lot of the thinking ourselves. Lo b'shamayim, it's not in the heavens, it's in our hands, is the danger that we might actually misinterpret the will of God and think that we are doing the will of God on earth, but actually we're in fact oppressing people, or we're not treating people well. And I think that that's the real danger. And I think that goes to, so like with Howard, what Howard was saying so beautifully, the work here that we're trying to do is trying to interpret, trying to understand in generation, trying to do our best to interpret the will of God in a way that is holding the dignity and humanity and fullness of everyone. And the question is, will we ever quite get there? But that's where we're trying to go. Okay, I'll pause there. Thank you, all of you, for digging in. For the text that I didn't get to read out loud, I'm excited to get to go back.
Can you tell us about Rachel Adler? I don't think you.
Oh yes, and I didn't tell you about Rachel Adler. So Rachel Adler, her also a major feminist theologian. Her book is called Engendering Judaism. You could see it there. Whereas Dr. Plaskow, I mean, she says a lot of things, but whereas Dr. Plaskow is sort of not sure whether or not we can stay within the halakhic system, and Dr. Ross is very much working within the halakhic system of saying, how do we change halakha while still maintaining divine revelation? Rachel Adler says, actually, any feminist theology, for any feminist theology to be viable, it has to still be, we have to find that language of halakha. And so one of the things that she has been a pioneer in is really thinking and putting forth new God language, new liturgy that's using feminist language for God, putting forth new, like even the marriage ritual itself, kiddushin, at its heart of it, is a man acquiring a woman. And so she's put forth a new wedding ritual that's like, we have to break down, it can't be, we can't stick with the old method of a man acquiring a woman, we're gonna have to figure out, and so really creating new rituals that bring women's full participation into these, into the area of halakha.
Thank you. And I think she lives up in LA, if I'm not correct.
Okay.
So she's a local. Can you tell us about next week's final class on 21st century?
Yeah, so bringing it to 21st century, we're still going to be, we're going to be finishing up our unit on Revelation. Next week, we're going to be looking at 3 different female poets on Revelation. We've been focusing on just naming, up until this session, all the voices we've looked at have been all male. Today we got to hear 3 female voices bringing in, or 2 female voices, 3 on your sheet, bringing in their different understandings of Revelation. Next week we're going to continue exploring Revelation through the lens of 3 female poets to bring their voices in, and looking at a more personal, individual experience of Revelation, as opposed to the communal lens we've been looking at.
Thank you. Well, thank you, everybody. Some good, deep discussion a lot to talk about in your very small Thanksgiving table, I guess. So thank you, Rabbi Strausberg, for taking us into feminist theology, and to 3 different speakers and some new books. Thank you to Avi Strausberg, who continues to participate in our program and add value. And thank you to all of you who participate, join us, and are learning. That's the point, to learn, to grow, to think, and hopefully get exposed to some new things. Thank you, and have a great holiday. Be safe, And I'm vegetarian, so I get a veggie turkey, but I hope you all get a real turkey. Was my favorite thing. That was the only meat I really miss. So enjoy your turkey. Okay, everybody. Take
Bye,
care.
everyone.
Good to see you. Bye, Lindy. Bye, Rena. Chris, good to see you. Okay, buddy. Be safe. See you on Sunday. Bye.